You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I am Paul Garner.
And we're back again to have another chat about God's creation. Should be a good one this time. Paul, we just had an episode go up on radiometric dating. And it stirred up a little bit of controversy because it is part of a series, an ongoing series that we're doing, And so we had sort of the introductory episode, which was sort of the bottom shelf version, the baby formula version of how these dating methods work. And then we had this one that was all about the hard stuff. And and we did not actually give an answer to the big questions, right? So as young age creationists, we don't actually think the Earth is 4.5 billion years old or that dinosaurs ruled the Earth 65 million years ago. So, so today we're going to actually talk a little bit more about critical thinking and about how to sort of, process these kinds of things. But we wanted to remind people, we've done 35 episodes now. We're up to 1,000 subscribers. Thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Don't forget.
Yeah, thank you.
Don't forget to like this video. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform, wherever you're hearing us. Give us some feedback. We appreciate that. You might have also noticed we recently opened up the comments on the YouTube video. So if you want to say something there, feel free. But after 35 episodes of Young Age Creationist content where we endorse Young Age Creationism, I hope everyone by now would be willing to go with us on the harder journeys of, well, maybe radiometric dating is harder than we thought, and it's more complicated than we thought, and that's okay.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to creationist interpretations of the radiometric data in later episodes in that series. That's right. People... who are looking forward to that, we're going to get to it.
Yeah, we're going to get to it.
Yeah.
I think the problem we're having, Paul, as I recall, it's been a while since we recorded. The problem we're having is figuring out what is the next episode. There are so many possibilities to talk about with this. And so we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense for our listeners and viewers to sort of process what we're saying.
Yeah. And I hope people will just come on a journey with us as we sort of explore many different aspects of this question over what's going to turn into, a series of many episodes.
I don't even know how many it'll be, 8 or 10, maybe a dozen. It's just going to go on because there's ongoing research too. That's the thing. It's not just this, we're going to solve the problem of radiometric dating in 50 minutes. It's going to take some time. And so, please be patient with us. We recognize that episode maybe it was not the most satisfying for our diehard creationist listeners. That's okay. There's more to come. Now, before we get right into the meat of this, Paul, I did want to wish you happy 4th of July.
Yes, those rebellious Americans.
Yes, those colonies. I think they can do whatever they want. The old joke, does Britain have a 4th of July?
No,
yes,
I haven't heard that.
You do have the 4th of July. You just don't celebrate it. It's one of those silly mind teasers, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway.
Yeah. We have just celebrated the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. So we've had our celebrations over here, which has been great. Yeah.
Interestingly, we did, that made the news over here in the United States. We saw some video. Apparently, one of the little princes made quite a spectacle of himself during a parade or something, which was very
that's
amusing.
Right.
Well, all right. So, back to our critical thinking question, critical thinking ideas. Where, one of the things that we want to do with this podcast that we were very committed to from the very start was to help people think deeper about these issues of creation. it's very easy, especially with social media, to just sort of pass along little platitudes and little ideas, memes and whatever, and think that this is really getting at the heart of the creation evolution question. And yeah, so our radiometric dating series is part of that. And this episode is part of that too, because this is something that I've found quite fascinating that's emerged over the past, I don't know how long they've been doing it. So Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International on their websites maintain lists called Arguments That Creationists Should Not Use. They've been doing it at least 20 years now, as I recall. And there's a whole long list of things that AIG and CMI both say this isn't a very good argument and we should probably not say that. I don't know that this list gets a lot of attention. Maybe it does. I don't hear about it a lot. I hear the arguments more than I hear people saying, that's on the list of things we shouldn't use. So maybe our episode here will help people to discover that list and maybe make some changes in what they think about things. That would be nice. Now, so before we get into talking about them, I thought it would be good to just talk for a second about why this happens, right? So I think in the world of sort of evangelical Christianity, there's sort of the idea that, at least over here in America, let's say that, there's the idea that our faith is built on a rock, right? This is right out of Scripture, built on a rock, and everybody else's opinions are shifting sand, right? And so what we think about truth doesn't change ever. And is that something you encounter in the UK as well, Paul? Sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes. I think because as Christians, we have the Bible, and the Bible is unchanging, and we believe that it's inerrant and infallible. I think sometimes there's a tendency to confuse our opinions about the Bible, or even extra biblical things that we think are consistent with the Bible, with what the Bible actually says.
Right.
So we can sometimes have an overconfidence in those other things. We should have confidence in the Scriptures, but we have to distinguish between our own views and opinions and what the Bible plainly says.
Yes, exactly. And in the world of science, right, this is a pretty common creationist trope. Science is built on opinions of men, and they're always changing, and the creation is built on the Word of God, and it doesn't change. Sort of. But creation science does change, right? So, for example, Answers in Genesis, the AIG Answers book. They've been putting out Answers books for at least the early 90s, late 80s. It's been going on for 30 years now. And if you pick up an early edition, like a first or second edition of the Answers book, it's completely different than the current ones that are being put out. And some of the arguments, guess what? They are on the list of arguments you shouldn't use. And so good for AIG to recognize, hey, we learned more, right? Science has changed, and that's okay, because there are new discoveries, and we change the way we approach creation and think about creation. And there's nothing heretical about that. There's nothing bad about that. In fact, it's good. When we learn new things, we ought to be changing our ideas and changing our minds about things, and not always just sitting back and going, we were right. It's not that simple, right?
Yeah, like you say, there's nothing nefarious about this. It is in the nature of science that things are going to change, that new data is going to come along, new ideas, new theories, new models. And that is exactly the same in creationism as it is in every other area of science. And so, we just have to recognize that our understanding of God's world is not going to remain static over time. There are obviously core truths that the Bible teaches.
Absolutely.
That we can hold to, but our understanding of how we put the natural world together, and sort of make sense of it, with the Bible as our foundation, is inevitably going to change over time.
Right. And just thinking about, the progress of science over the 20th century. When the 20th century began, there was no powered flight. And when the 20th century ended, we had sent probes to nearly every planet, almost every planet in the solar system. We had put people on the moon. We had, at the beginning of the 20th century, I think this is right, the state of medicine was just getting into the whole notion of germ theory and the idea of where diseases come from. And now we have x-rays, we have CAT scans, we have so much more. We understand DNA. We understand inheritance a lot better than we used to. We have the Human Genome Project. We have thousands of human genomes. So the amount of change that's happened over the 20th century is dramatic. And yes, the truths of Scripture do not change. The salvation that Jesus offers us, the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, there are definitely things that do not change over that time that we can rely on. But our conception of the world and our place in the world has dramatically changed. So it should be no surprise that if you pick up a creation book from 50 years ago and you're really excited about it, or even 30 years ago and you're really excited about it, you might want to temper that enthusiasm a little bit because things have progressed a lot. That's just how it goes. So that's one of the challenges, I think, is just people read a book about creation in college, 30 years ago or whatever, and they like that idea and they have stuck with it, and not knowing and not really understanding how to keep in touch with creation scientists, and the world of creation science has changed and moved on. So all that to say, brace yourself. I hope we've picked out a few of these arguments to talk about today that aren't going to ruffle too many feathers. But if you are listening to this as a complete novice and only know things you might have heard in sermons from time to time, you might find this episode a bit shocking. Rest assured, Paul and I, as seasoned, well-versed creationists who've been in this for decades, we are not shocked by any of these things. They don't really bother us. It is what it is. And some of these, I know at least one of these is going to be very personal for me. So I'm going to share my own story there. But anyway, well, Paul, let's just talk about a few of these. You want to start us off on the list here?
Yeah, so we kind of drew up a short list because there are a lot of these things that we could have talked about. So we had to be selective. And maybe at some point we'll come back to some more.
Yeah, we could.
Who knows, in a future episode. But the first one on the list is one that, we probably both hear this all the time.
Yeah.
People who say, evolution is just a theory.
Yeah.
And the implication, I think, being that because it's just a theory, that we don't really need to take it too seriously.
Right.
It's just a kind of wild hunch, a kind of wild guess. I think the problem with this argument is that it kind of draws on this equivocation between the way people use the word theory in just everyday speech, when they do mean, it's just my guess, my hunch. People say, I've got a theory about this, or I've got a theory about that. And the way that scientists use the word theory.
Yeah, that's right.
So for scientists, when they use the word theory, they're talking about a coherent model or a framework that explains a lot of data.
Yeah.
So, Einstein's theory of relativity, it's a theory. You referred earlier to the germ theory of disease.
That's right, yeah.
The idea that diseases are caused by microscopic organisms. I mean, that's a theory, but that doesn't mean it's just a wild hunch or a wild guess. It's a well-established idea supported by lots of data. And so I think when people say, evolution is just a theory, it betrays a certain lack of understanding of how scientists use that word, what they mean by that word. So I guess if people want to say, evolution is just a wild hunch, they should probably just say that. Yeah. They should just say evolution is a wild hunch. Now, I happen to think that they're wrong about that too. Evolution is not just some kind of wild guess. Here's where we start to get into some hot water, maybe. Because you wrote infamously a blog post that gets
let's not link to that in the show notes. Let's not do that.
No. About the evidence for evolution. Now, the thing to recognize is that evolution does have a lot of evidential support. There's lots of evidence for evolution.
Sure.
And by evidence, we mean data that corresponds with or is consistent with that particular theory. And there's loads of evidence of that kind for evolution. You can go to any textbook. I've got some here, for Toomer's evolution or Ridley's evolution, which I also have here. There's lots of evidence for evolution. You can read it in the textbooks. That does not mean that evolution is true.
Right.
This is what's so hard, I think, for people to understand. False theories can be supported by lots of evidence.
Yeah.
When we acknowledge that evolution has evidential support, it does not mean that evolution is the only or even the best explanation for that evidence.
Right.
As creationists, we think that there are better explanations are consistent with Scripture. It doesn't mean when we say that there's evidence for evolution that we think that all of the evidence favors evolution, because it doesn't. There are bits of evidence that are very poorly explained by conventional evolutionary theories. And I think this complexity of what we mean by a theory and what it means for a theory to have evidential support is actually quite difficult for people to grasp when they're sort of just used to thinking of a theory as just some kind of wild guess. So that's kind of how I would approach this.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to sort of add to that.
I think you're right that there are data that correspond to evolution. Otherwise, no one would believe it. If it didn't have any data, we're scientists. We're not going to believe in fairies or energies or energy. That's a bad example. Psychic energy or anything like that. That's not. There's no data for that. So yeah, evidence for evolution and things like that. There must be something to it. Yeah. Otherwise, why would everyone believe it? Or why would so many people believe it? And I think it's just, it's reasonable to admit that.
And it's not black and white where, a theory is wrong and it has no evidential support whatsoever.
Right.
There is no evidence, for this theory. So it's clearly wrong. And this theory over here is clearly right because all of the evidence supports this idea. I mean, that's just not how science works, right? That's not a reflection of, the reality of the complexity of the world and how we understand it.
Yeah, that's right.
So don't say evolution is just a theory, because it's going to be misunderstood, for one thing. People are going to just say, well,
you don't know what you're talking about.
You don't know what a theory is.
Yeah.
That's what people are going to
And we don't want people to say that about us. That's not true. That's one of the anti-creationist arguments. We're gonna do that next episode. We're gonna talk about all the bad anti-creationist arguments that evolutionists shouldn't use. But for now, let's continue with this discussion here. Here's another good one. Micro.
Yeah, I was gonna say you got another one.
Yeah, I got another one for you. Micro versus macro evolution. This one is one of my long-standing pet peeves. And this is just, I can't tell you how many people try to explain this to me, and I just think that's not how those words are used.
Right.
Microevolution is a technical term that people in the field of evolutionary biology understand. And they understand it to mean evolution that you can observe in your lifetime. It is almost always evolution within a species. It is usually evolution within a population, a limited part of a species, not just within the broader species, but just within part of it. And it's something that you can observe over time periods. When you take a sample of the population in one time and you take a sample of the population another, the population has changed in some way. That's microevolution. That's what an evolutionary biologist means by microevolution. And a macroevolution is basically anything more than speciation, right? If your speciation changes to the point where, wow, I don't think I would put this in the same family anymore, that's macroevolution. Creationists have tried to grab onto these terms and redefine them. So the most common one that I get is microevolution refers to changes within a kind, and macroevolution refers to changes between kinds, from one kind to another. Microevolution happens and macroevolution doesn't. And that's cute, and I get it, but that's not at all the way the words are defined. I find it really problematic when we creationists come in and try to redefine words that are already in use in the world of science. It just creates confusion. It doesn't communicate things. It might communicate things to within our little camp, but it doesn't help us to talk to anybody else. So that's the sort of thing where you kind of get into, you're getting into an echo chamber there where you're not actually communicating successfully. And so I tend to think we ought to avoid that distinction. And I know I say it every time people tell me this, and I know the next church I go to, somebody's going to say, well, there's a difference between microevolution and macroevolution, evolution within a kind and evolution between kinds. It's a losing battle at this point, but I'm not going to stop fighting it.
Yeah, right.
That's not what those words mean.
No, you're absolutely right. And I already mentioned Fatuma's book. You go to Fatuma, and it's clear, that the standard definition of microevolution is essentially change within species or within populations, and macroevolution is change above the level of a species. So when you say I accept microevolution but not macroevolution, what someone familiar with the standard definitions of those terms hears you saying is that you believe in the fixity of species.
Yep.
And that is not what creation biologists think.
That's right.
We do not think that species are fixed. And so by using those terms in non-standard ways, we actually, like you say, create confusion about our own position. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah, that's...
because we think, based on the baraminology work that's been done, based on clues from scripture, we think that the kind is somewhat higher than the level of species, probably around the level of a family, as an approximation, at least in vertebrates. That means that we accept that perhaps new genera might originate within a created kind. Now, according to the standard definitions, that is called macroevolution. So, creationists actually accept some degree of macroevolution, assuming those standard definitions we've just talked about. So making this distinction between micro and macro, I just think it muddies the waters. Yeah. And rather than trying to redefine standard terms, we're probably best just coming up with our own terminology.
I tried.
If we want to say something meaningful about the difference between what's going on within kinds and between kinds, let's come up with
Come
new
up with a
language.
different word. Yes. I
That would be much better.
I try to avoid macroevolution and microevolution unless I'm actually talking about microevolutionary change. I don't like telling people that creationists accept a certain bit of macroevolution. Everybody misunderstands that. So you get the evolutionists who freak out and go, creationists aren't creationists anymore, which is dumb. Duh. Yeah. And then you get creationists who freak out and go, you're an evolutionist. No. That's not, So I just avoid those words altogether, all the way around.
Yeah.
Just won't use those words. Find some other word to use.
Yeah. That's probably good advice.
Yeah. All right. Well, how about another on our list here?
Yeah.
What do you got?
Well, do you want to tackle if we came from apes? Why are there still apes? Because this one is one that comes up
all the time.
Kind of all the time.
Yeah, I hear it regularly. Yeah.
It's one of those kinds of things that you hear on social media. I don't think people who are sort of well informed, sort of creationists kind of fall back on this one. But it is the kind of thing that a lot of ordinary people, will say if they're not terribly well informed about.
Sure.
The whole question.
Right.
And I think that the problem here, the reason this is such a well, there are a couple of things really wrong with it. The first thing to say about this, if we came from apes, well, the first thing is that evolutionary theory doesn't actually say that we came from modern apes, which might be the implication that you would draw from this. Evolutionary theory is not saying that we descended from chimps and gorillas. It's saying that chimps and gorillas and humans shared a common ancestor in the past that may have looked somewhat ape-like, but it would not have been a modern ape.
Right.
So that's the first sort of point of clarification, I think. And then perhaps sort of more importantly, it misunderstands the nature of how evolution is thought to work, which is by divergence.
Right.
So essentially an ancestral species splits and diverges to give rise to a descendant species. And often it's thought within evolutionary theory that this happens in small isolated populations that kind of split off from the main population, and then they experience some genetic change that reinforces that reproductive isolation, and they become a new species. But notice that there's nothing in evolutionary theory that says that when that happens, the original ancestral species has to go extinct.
Right.
It can coexist with the descendant species. Right. So there is nothing that says that, if we descended from an ape-like ancestor that apes can't exist today. There's nothing in evolutionary theory that says that, any more than the fact that I have ancestors. I have a grandfather, and a father and a mother.
That's right. Yes.
I can coexist with those people. I can
That's
overlap in time with those people who are my ancestors, and it works the same for species.
Yeah.
So it's just a misunderstanding, I think, of evolutionary theory.
Yeah. I got a whole video on that on my Ask a Creationist series. And it's one of those things that it's just so bad. I hate to even talk about it because it's embarrassingly bad. I don't want to embarrass anybody who thought that was a good idea. But if you did think that was a good idea, a good thing to say, don't say that. That's actually not really that good, and you should probably stop saying that. Because
as Christians, we should have a high regard for truth, for being able to represent what others are saying accurately, and to have a high standard of intellectual honesty.
Right.
And if we're going to do that, we've got to represent the arguments that the other side are making correctly.
Yes.
And if we're not representing them correctly, then we kind of need to put that right. And this is one objection to evolution that misunderstands what the other side are saying.
Right.
And so we should just drop it.
Yeah, we should just drop it. Exactly. And those diagrams, or those movies. I mean, I've seen it all over the place. I've seen these the March of Progress stuff, right? Where you have the little thing coming out of the little fish coming out of the ocean, and then he becomes a lizard, and then he becomes a monkey, and then he loses his tail and he's an ape, and then he stands upright. That's cute, but it has nothing to do with evolution. Okay, it's not. I guess as an insignia, it might have something to do with evolution, but it doesn't actually represent what evolutionary biologists actually think is happening with evolution. So, yeah, put that stuff out of your mind. It's not that one population is completely transformed into a totally different thing. It is that members of a species diverge, species become diverse, and they diverge, and eventually evolutionists say they would branch, they diverge far enough that they're totally different. And there's extinction involved, true enough. There are ancestral populations that are believed to be extinct and no longer around, and maybe we don't even have good fossils of them. But that doesn't mean that, just because we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? That's not how. Yeah. That's not how it works. It just meant that things diverged and became different.
Yeah.
All right,
now, Todd, I've got one for you actually.
All right,
I'd like to ask you to comment on.
Okay.
And it's one of these really popular things that you hear said. No new species have ever been shown to originate. Right. No new species have ever arisen. Todd, you're a biologist, so tell us about this. No new species.
Oh, so first of all, that depends on what you mean by no. It depends on what you mean by new, and it depends on what you mean by species. And those three words, tough to define. Well, I guess no is pretty straightforward. No, usually when people say there are no new species, no one's ever observed it. They're meaning it in an absolute sense. Absolutely not, never, ever, no how, no way, never. Okay, fine. So it's an absolute absence of this. So then, of course, the biologist gives you some examples where populations were isolated in historical times, and later on we discovered they can no longer successfully interbreed with the population that started them. And I think there's some examples of rabbits and things like this where this has happened. And so by the biological concept of species, so the biological species notion says that if, two populations that are not able to interbreed are different species, that's rough. And yes, I know biologists have great many arguments about what is or is not a species, and that does not apply to every species, but that is a species concept that is very common. And so, you show these examples where these populations have been isolated. Maybe they've been on an island or on the other side of a mountain chain or something like that. And so the no new species advocate will say, well, that's not really a different species, right? Because it is clearly the same thing. They are visually indistinguishable, but they just happen to have some weird mating incompatibility. Or they will fall back on it's not new, right? It's not really new because it's clearly the same thing you started with. And so there's a degree to which that argument turns into what we call special pleading, which is where you just take all the rules and you make exceptions to them in order to make your point, redefine words in order to try to drive home whatever argument you're making. It's a terrible way to make arguments. It's just not a good thing. So, I tend to think no new species is a dead end. And frankly, with a modern state of creation biology, admitting, created kinds contain more than one species and that there have been species arising since creation, you're kind of shooting us in the foot by saying and really, pushing this notion that there are no new species. That's basically an anti-creationist argument now. So you should probably stop saying that. That hurts us. So yeah, not a big fan of that. No. Either way it manifests, the concept that there hasn't been this observation, I think, is probably not exactly right. And special pleading in order to say that, well, there's no new this or no new that. Yeah, well, maybe there is. I think the more interesting question is, where do these species come from? How did they originate? What's the mechanism of their genesis? Is it simply random mutation and natural selection, or is there some sort of divine process guiding the production of species in order to diversify created kinds and ensure their survival and that sort of thing? So I think those questions are more interesting to me. And of course, the questions of, well, is it really plausible that, vertebrates and echinoderms share a common ancestor, right? So you go into the evolutionary literature, starfish and people are more closely related than starfish and jellyfish. And you, as a listener, may find that really weird, but yeah, that is the standard evolutionary doctrine. So I think those kind of questions are really interesting to talk about. What is the evidence of these broad evolutionary relationships that are being posited? But I think just falling back on no new species that's not really helpful.
Yeah, we'll underline it again. We are not species fixers.
Right.
We do not accept species fixers. And so these examples of new species arising, new biological species, and there are lots of them in the literature, they do not threaten the creationist model in any sense at all. Nope. And denying that they happen is not a good argument.
Probably not.
Evolution. So yeah, that's very, very helpful. Okay.
All right, what else is on the list here?
Well, there are a couple of other things on the list. Shall we talk about plesiosaurs?
Yeah, let's talk about plesiosaurs. So,
because that's fun.
So let me set the stage here. I was going to a Christian high school, Paul, back in the 80s. Some of you might remember the 80s, so although fewer remember the 80s than used to. And every year in my English class, my high school was great. They really prepared us well for college and for studies beyond that. And every year, my English class required us to write a research paper, which, of course, meant, you had to go to the library and you had to look up things and you had to write something about a particular topic. And you had to cite your sources and all that sort of thing. And it was a big production. And we were told, don't use the school library. You should go at least to the main branch of the county library, and better yet, go to a college library and look up things there. So it was kind of a big deal. And so my 10th grade year, I chose to write about sea serpents. So
why not?
Yeah, why not? It's a great thing. And in the school library, I found this book called The Great Dinosaur Mystery and the Bible. Some of you might remember The Great Dinosaur Mystery and the Bible. And in the edition that I had at that time, there was a full-page photograph of this dead carcass of a thing that had been found by Japanese fishermen 30 miles east of Christchurch, New Zealand. Okay. And I was sure, the book said, this looks like a living plesiosaur. And I was sure they were right. It did look like a living plesiosaur. And so it was my star witness in my paper on sea serpents. I threw in the Loch Ness Monster. I threw in, all these historical stories about sea serpents. I said, clearly, these marine creatures from the dinosaur sediments, those creatures are still around, and so maybe maybe the 65 million year thing is wrong. And so this is a great argument for creation. And yeah, that was me in 1988. Big deal. And so in grad school, I sort of got involved in the online creation world, and I discovered what at the time was called AltaVista. It was the big search engine, right? And you could look up things. Mm-hmm. And I happened to come across a guy who had a copy of the scientific report that had been published. I think you have a copy there, Paul, right? The scientific report.
I have a whole file in my filing cabinet on this thing, including a copy of the original scientific report, which is a set of collected papers by scientists in Japan.
That's right, yeah.
Which I obtained from, I think, the National Science Museum in Tokyo back in 1985.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And I got mine in 1996. So this thing was discovered in 78, I want to say. It was
77.
77.
It was 25th of April, 1977.
All right, good. So in 1977, I learned about it 11 years later, and all the references that I could ever find on it. I went, I looked through the periodical guide to the literature and all that sort of thing, and all I could find on it were some magazine articles that had been published in English. And that's it. And that was the only thing that was available. So I was smitten and enamored. And when I finally came across the research report, I wrote to the guy who had it, and I said, please send me, will you please send me a photocopy of your copy of the report? And from there, I posted that on the CRS, the Creation Research Society email list at the time. And I said, I've got this report. And people wrote me and said, please send me a copy. So I started making copies of this thing and sending it out to people. And so I was disappointed. Because, of course, the naysayers over the years had always tried to tell me that this was the dead body of a shark. And I thought, there's no way it looks like a plesiosaur. It's got a long neck and a little head, and it's got flippers. It's clearly a plesiosaur. It's not a shark. No way it's a shark. And so I get the report and I look at it, and at the time I was studying biochemistry at the University of Virginia, so I was being well versed in the arena of biochemistry and how to do biochemical studies. And so I looked at the biochemical chapter where they took the sample of material that they had taken from the body and compared it to shark tissue, and sure enough, it just matched perfectly. Yeah. Close to perfect. Close enough that I knew as a biochemistry student, this is a shark.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Oops.
And they did some other things as well. I mean, they took tissue samples, which, as you say, were almost identical to modern basking shark elastidin, which is a protein that you find in basking sharks. The carcass had fins with fin rays, which is characteristic of fish. Reptiles like plesiosaurs did not have flippers like that. Right. They had bony limb supports. Mm-hmm. And the body proportions, because they took measurements of the carcass, and the body proportions were basically consistent with a shark.
Right.
But not with a plesiosaur.
No.
So, for example, the animal had short ribs, which is consistent with a fish that has a cartilaginous skeleton rather than a bony skeleton. So it's a basking shark. Basically.
It's a shark.
It had been dead, I think, for about 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
Before they hauled it up.
A very long time.
And one of the things that we now know about basking sharks is that they, as they decay, as they decompose, they can actually take on a rather plesiosaur-like appearance. Right. For example, a lot of the tissue around the gills kind of falls away, and what it leaves you is what looks like a long neck with a small head. And so that some people have actually referred to decomposing basking sharks as pseudo plesiosaurs because they can look surprisingly plesiosaur-like. And there are lots of cases of this kind of mistaken identity out there in the literature.
Right.
So disappointing.
Yeah, disappointing. So I felt it's curious because I get that thing, and I felt this guilt for writing that paper when I was 16 years old, and now I'm a grad student going, oh, I totally blew it. So I actually wrote up a thing and published it in the Creation Research Society Quarterly to set the records straight. That whoa, wait a minute, guys, and I went through the whole I went through the entire set of papers and summarized all the points that were in favor or against the plesiosaur interpretation, and I basically said it's pretty obviously a shark and not a plesiosaur, and so we should probably stop talking about it.
And I did the same thing. I wrote this little article all about the why it's a basking shark, which was published in our journal Origins back in '96. Again, just trying to set the record straight, because it was a popular argument, because people thought that if we had surviving plesiosaurs, maybe that was a strike against the geological timescale, or an example of a living fossil, so this thing hadn't evolved.
And I've never quite understood that, right? If you stop to think about it, we've had discoveries of what are called living fossils. Most famous, I think, would be the coelacanth found off the coast of South Africa in 1939, later discovered to have a small population much farther north. Evolution didn't collapse because of that. and it, another thing that I heard people say about it was that we discovered that they were, it's a member of a group called the lobed finfish. And these are the sort of the fish that have really a lot of bony chunks in their fins. And so they're thought to represent a transition between the ocean marine fish and land-going creatures. And so one thing that was said was that no, they're deep water fish. Those are not, shallow water things trying to come up on the shore. And, that's an interesting observation. And I've made that observation myself. But when you stop to think about it, that doesn't mean that that's going to be the same for every member of that group, right? So if you think about cats today, we have jungle cats, we have desert cats, we have Arctic cats, mountain cats, and valley cats. Just because one cat prefers a particular environment doesn't mean that all cats will prefer that environment. So yeah, I don't know that even if it were true that they pulled up a plesiosaur, that would be some shocking falsification of evolution. It just, I think people would be excited about it, and it would be like Jurassic Park come to life, and then people would go on with their lives. It wouldn't really change much at all.
It would be great. It'd be very exciting, but it wouldn't materially change anything.
No. Well, Paul,
now we sorry, I was going to say we just have one more.
Okay, we do have one more. Okay.
Argument.
Uh-oh.
We have one more argument on our list, and we probably should just deal with that one, and then we need to kind of think about, what this all means.
Yeah, what does it all mean exactly?
The last one that I have on my list is there are no beneficial mutations, and this I hear again, quite a lot. There are no beneficial mutations, and I guess we should begin by just explaining, first of all, what a mutation is, and then I think we need to think about
what does it mean?
What do we mean by beneficial?
Beneficial, yes, exactly. And my response to that argument is beneficial for what? Right?
Yeah, right. So what's a mutation?
It's a permanent change in a DNA sequence. So it might be a single DNA letter that's been swapped out for another one. It might be a piece of DNA has been cut out. It might be a piece of DNA has been inserted. It might be part of your chromosome has been rearranged. A chunk has been pulled out and swapped around and put back in again, and so that it's backwards from what it used to be. They're all manner of things that are mutations. Sometimes people think of them as mistakes. That is a class of mutation. That there are replication errors. They usually occur about 1 or 2 per genome, per human genome, every time you copy your DNA. You get 1 or 2 errors, which is not bad because you're copying about 3.3 billion letters. So 1 error, not a big deal. But yeah, that's kind of but mutations can arise from other sources as well. It's not just mistakes in copying. It can be chemicals that alter the sequence, things like carcinogens, too much X-ray, too much ultraviolet light, too much sunlight, right? That can cause mutations and so forth. There's just a lot of things that can cause permanent changes to DNA. Now, can there be something that's beneficial? And again, beneficial only ever means anything in a context, right? So there's no absolute good or bad outside of a context, right? So, and it's pretty easy to see. If you think about all the DNA I have, is it all beneficial for me? Well, it's beneficial for me as long as I stay in the air, breathing air, right? It's beneficial for me as long as I eat food and drink water on a regular basis. It's beneficial for me as long as I get rid of waste products from my body on a regular basis. Beneficial only ever means anything in a context of what things are doing, right? So the real interesting question, I think, is it possible that there could be some sort of change in an environment wherein something that arose as a permanent change in the DNA can actually provide some kind of help to a creature that has that change? And the answer is, yeah. Oh, yeah, there's lots of examples of that. Now, if the environment changes again, that could then turn into something that's a disadvantage, right? Yeah. It could go back to being bad, or unhelpful, at the very least, unhelpful. But this notion that somehow all mutations are bad, or there is no beneficial mutation, it's all depending on the context. And so
I think it might be helpful just to help people understand this is to give an example.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
well, one example that I've heard, and I've used it myself, and you'll have to tell me whether you agree, you think this is a useful example or not, concerns flightless beetles on oceanic islands.
I don't think that's a good example. I think I know where you're going.
Okay,
but it's modified though. So yeah. Why don't you explain it to us?
Well, the example I've heard is that you have a population of beetles on an oceanic island somewhere. Some of those beetles, when they're flying around, they obviously end up getting swept into the ocean by the wind, and they drown. So a mutation arises which causes flightlessness in the beetles. Could happen in a variety of ways. Could be fusing of the wing case so it's permanently closed or something like that. And this confers a survival advantage on the beetles because now the beetles are surviving happily because they're not being swept into the ocean and drowned. Mm-hmm. So the mutation quickly spreads throughout the population and you end up with a population of flightless beetles.
Right.
Now that's an example I've heard.
Yep.
You're the biologist. You tell me. Is that a good example, or have you got better ones?
Well, it's actually more complicated than that, which is the theme of the show. Everything is more complicated than that. So,
sure.
So what you're talking about actually comes straight out of Origin of Species. That was Darwin's explanation for why you go onto islands and you find so many flightless beetles, which he thought was a weird pattern that needed explaining. And so he said, well, maybe the wind is blowing them out to sea. It turns out it's really a matter of the size of the island versus the proximity to the coast. Right? So if you imagine just a tiny little beetle living on an island that's maybe the size of the North Island of New Zealand, right? Where it's really big and the coast can be miles away. That beetle is unlikely to be blown out to sea. It's just not likely to happen. Yeah. Whereas if you're living on a very small island, then the coast tends to be quite close. And so then you might get a certain advantage. But it turns out that flight polymorphism is a common thing in beetles. This is something that is an active area of research among insect biologists. They like to study what is called flight polymorphism. So it turns out that a bunch of species of beetles have populations where they produce certain members that have wings and certain members that do not have wings. And why would they do that? And why would they maintain that? Why not just evolve wings or not wings? What's the purpose of maintaining some members of the species with wings and some members of the species without wings? And the answer seems to be related to the amount of energy that wings take. Flying is extremely demanding on the energy that a beetle has. And so it can actually reduce the number of offspring that flighted beetles will leave. So that's not great. So in reality, the disadvantage is being able to fly, but for a different reason. And then the change that produces flightlessness, that's advantageous because you're producing more offspring. So according to natural selection, the flightless form should be preferred around, for all beetle species. However, if the beetles are living in an environment where there are unstable resources, then the ability to fly to find new resources is suddenly an advantage. And so having to crawl across, some open landscape trying to find another patch of plants to eat, not so great. It exposes you to beetle predators and it exposes you to the elements. You might not have enough energy to make the journey, but if you can fly, you can get there lickety-split. So the weird question isn't necessarily why you have flightless beetles on islands, but why do you have these populations where you have some forms that have the ability to fly, wings and the ability to fly, and some forms that don't? And the answer seems to be related to unstable local environments. Think of a puddle drying up or something like that, where you'd have to go and find new resources. That seems to be the more relevant. So is that an example where a mutation is helpful? It's a perfect example of exactly what I was trying to say, and that is, well, so long as you have plenty of resources at your disposal, not being able to fly is quite good because you'll leave lots of offspring. But if you suddenly find yourself in an environment where your water supply has dried up, or you've eaten all the plant material around, well, you better be able to get to another source of resources really quick, or you could die, right? Bunch of your beetles will die. And so being able to fly is suddenly the more advantageous thing. So advantageous, beneficial and harmful mutation shifts with the tide. I guess that's the point here. You can have things that are bad in one circumstance, and then the environment changes and they're suddenly good.
Yeah.
It's goofy.
So the claim that there are no beneficial mutations is not a great argument, because there clearly are mutations that are beneficial, at least in terms of survival advantage.
Yeah.
In at least some context, in at least some situations.
Right. And the special pleading
so-
person will say, well, you change the environment back and it's suddenly not beneficial anymore. Well, yeah. Right. Yeah. But while the environment was in that state, that was a beneficial mutation to have.
And that's fascinating about flightless beetles. So you're absolutely right. That was kind of an argument that sort of comes out of Origin of Species.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And it's a nice example, but it's more complex, as these questions so often are. So we need to think then about kind of what all this.
What does it all mean?
Right? Why should we talk about bad arguments?
So
we're not just being party poopers.
Although
we used to be, we used to being unpopular and drawing flack, I suppose. But unfortunately, so why should we talk about these bad arguments?
So I'm thinking it's nice to have lists of arguments that you shouldn't use to make sure that people understand that no, that's not a good argument. And there's obviously a level of expertise involved, right? So the average person reading that article on the Japanese basking shark fibers, they're not going to be able to necessarily fully appreciate all the detailed nuances of biochemistry, whereas someone who is studying biochemistry or has studied biochemistry, they will be able to read it and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I want to get people to a position where I don't have to constantly correct them, right? It would be nice if we could maybe close out this episode with a couple of strategies for how do you recognize an argument that maybe I should not repeat that one. I don't know that it's right or wrong, but it's suspicious. When should an argument be suspicious? And I'm not talking about an argument where it's an argument for evolution and so it's suspicious versus an argument for creation, which is not suspicious. I'm talking about getting away from our confirmation bias and our tendency to agree with people who already agree with us, and think more about, how do I think critically about things that I'm told? And one of the things that I like to encourage people to do is to think about the source of the information. And purveyors of bad arguments have sort of seized on this this strategy, this advice people give, and tried to put sources on their bad arguments. Here's the source for my bad argument. So part of this then is to think through what the source actually is. Because sometimes I'll see a source and I literally can't tell. I don't know what that is, right? They'll just say, here's a source, and it's some word that I've never seen before that refers to maybe some website or something. I'm going to be suspicious of that. If it's a science thing and the source is Fox News or CNN or, I don't even know, Newsmax or Huffington Post, I'm going to be real skeptical of all of those people, because the people that write for those organizations are not necessarily scientists, right? So there are science news places that are
and for those
slightly better.
I was just going to say, for those in the UK, you might think of the Daily Mail or the Sun or something like that. They are not good sources for news stories about science.
But I think most news outlets are not good sources for science.
No.
Most news outlets, you're putting in a reporter who had a biology class in college and you're asking them to write about this latest finding, and think about what would happen if you, the non-scientist listener, was asked to write up a report about some science article. It would be overwhelming. I mean, it would be like asking me to write up an article about engineering or art or music. I couldn't do that. I don't know that. I don't know those things. So yeah, you gotta consider the source. And so for us, the gold standard is always going to be the science journal, right? That's where a scientist goes to publish his findings and get it reviewed by other scientists. And even then you can have, unfortunately, we have a proliferation of lousy journals nowadays that look like journals and pretend to be journals, but are not journals. So you kind of got to go one step further. It may be in something called the Journal of Scientific Discovery, but it may turn out that the Journal of Scientific Discovery will publish whatever you send them as long as you send them $1,000.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, yeah, it's a tough thing, but there's a certain first approximation level of critical thinking there that says, all right, who is saying this and how would they know these things? And so maybe you sort of come away and think, I don't know about that. So that's one thing that I tell people.
Another clue, I suppose, is whether the person making the claim has expertise in that particular discipline. You know, I'm going to be much more likely to take the advice, health advice from a trained medical doctor than from an engineer or a geologist.
Sure.
And likewise, if you want to know about geology, you need to ask a geologist rather than somebody else.
Right.
They are the ones who have some expertise in that field.
Right. And that goes for speakers that come to your church, right? So maybe your church is hosting a creation weekend and has brought in a creation scientist. Okay, well, what is this creation scientist good at, right? What did they train in? And maybe that person is trained in biochemistry, like me. And so maybe you should be careful about what they tell you about geology. Right? And maybe that person is trained in geology or physics, and maybe you should be careful about what they tell you about biology. And that's not disrespectful. It's just reality. And when I go and talk about fossils, I try to tell people I am not trained in this field. I am a computational biologist foremost. And so I know about, analyzing data. And so I've been able to get this data about these fossils and I analyze it. And that's what I do. I don't know about the context of the fossils. I don't know about their preservation. I don't know about, those are things that I don't know about because I'm not an expert in that area. So I try to be open and honest with people when I talk to them about these things and try not to make them think that I'm more than I am, because I'm not. So, other things that one can do. One thing that I definitely do, any meme, any cartoon that I see on my social media, totally disregarded right away. I don't care if I think it's right, and I laugh at it and I go and I nod in agreement. Yeah. As far as being a scholarly commentary on the state of the creation evolution debate, it's definitely oversimplified.
Yes.
And it might not be something you ought to be repeating or sharing on your feed.
Yeah, memes are for entertainment purposes only. Yeah. And sometimes not even great entertainment.
No, sometimes they're not entertaining. Sometimes they just make me roll my eyes and think, you have no idea what you're talking about. Whoever made this. It's clueless. Yeah.
One other thing that I think is helpful in people sort of discerning what's a good and a bad argument is beware of what I call the magic bullet.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
If somebody is presenting to you an argument that they say is the knockdown argument, it's going to destroy all of the arguments of the opposition. This is the one single piece of evidence that does the job, be very suspicious. Magic bullet arguments are usually really, really bad arguments, whoever is using them.
Yep.
So that, it just is a complete misunderstanding of the nature of science and how scientific evidence works.
Right.
To think that there is just this one killer fact
Yep.
that you can pull out of the bag
And all of evolution
destroys
collapses.
everything.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Yeah, or the whole of creationism collapses.
Oh yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's next time. That's the next episode.
That's next time.
But yeah, you're right. And I think some of that comes from just the history of creationism. I remember George McCready Price back in, the early 20th century was trying to tell people that all of evolution depended on the order of the fossil record. And if you could show the order of the fossil record was wrong, then evolution collapsed, which no, there's a lot more to it than that. So that was never really a very good strategy, even at the time. But I also think people, science is hard. Evolution is complicated. And so, I often, I've encountered people who've told me, just give me one thing that I can really wrap my brain around and understand. And I don't think that's a bad thing, as long as you remember it's really complicated and you don't understand everything. It's really complicated and I don't understand everything. And if I don't understand everything, come on. I've been studying this for decades and I still don't get it all. So it's okay that you don't have a good grasp on every little detail. There's no shame in that. And you shouldn't let it shake your faith in what the scripture has to say. And your own personal walk with Christ, your own encounters with God, how he's led you and how he's answered prayer in your life. You should be remembering those milestones and monuments from your own experience. And that's really where your faith needs to be, in God, in his word, not in what I tell you about creation science, even if it's a really good argument. But yeah, whenever somebody tells me they've got a really good argument, I am, that just takes evolution down, or you can refute this idea in 5 minutes or whatever. Nope. I immediately, nope, shut it down. Not true, not correct. You're wrong. I don't know what you're going to tell me, but I guarantee you it's probably not right. All right. Well.
Yeah. Great.
Any other suggestions? Any other thoughts? I think that's my usual thing that I tell people.
I think the only other thing I'd just say at the end is people should not be discouraged by excising bad arguments from creationism. Ultimately, it can only strengthen our case for creationism. Yeah. It is not a good strategy to tie a good argument to a bad one, and we have lots of good arguments and we have lots of evidence that we can talk about, and we do not need to rely on bad arguments. That will only weaken our case, because our critics will latch onto that and say, you guys don't know what you're talking about because you're using this terrible argument. And we should do ourselves a favor by trying not to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as possible.
And speaking of critics, come back next time, because they're going to be on the hot seat. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander.
Yeah, they're not off the hook.
Yeah, we talked about bad arguments creationists shouldn't use. Let's talk about bad arguments the anti-creationists should stop using, because it's tiresome and tedious and dull. Anyway.
Yeah, that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun.
Anyway, well, thank you for listening to this episode. Remember, again, like this video if you're on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell to be alerted to when we post new content. Thank you again, 1,000 subscribers. Shocking, right? I can hardly believe we got 1,000 people regularly signed up to listen to us. It's pretty cool. If you're listening on another platform, consider leaving us a review. If you're on one of our podcasting platforms, we do appreciate that. Spread the word. If you really like an episode, share it. We appreciate that as well. And remember, we are supported largely through donations. Core Academy of Science is one of the sponsoring organizations. You can find us at coresci.org. And if you go to coresci.org/donate, you will find links to ways that you can support Core Academy in the production of this video. Paul, Biblical Creation Trust is also a supporter of the work that we're doing here. Why don't you tell us about them?
Yes, you can find us on social media. We have an active Facebook page. But if you go to our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org, there is a donate button on our homepage. And if you click on that, it will take you to a giving page. And it's got all of the various ways that you can support us, all of the ways that you can give to us, including a PayPal facility for those who are located outside the UK.
Great.
So, check it out. We do appreciate all of your support.
And if you would like to get in touch with us, please go ahead and check us out at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. There you'll find links to the past episodes. You'll find out what's coming up on next episodes. You can contact us directly. We're also on Facebook. Let's Talk Creation is on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We are on Instagram. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can contact us there. You can leave a comment now on our YouTube videos. We thought, why not do an experiment, see how that works out. And you can send us an email, podcast@coresci.org. So if you're happy with this episode, if you're sad about this episode, feel free to reach out and we'll try to, set things right if we can, or console you if we can't. Anyway, that's all for this episode. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Come back, and all you anti-creationists surely will want to tune in for this one. See you then.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.